Hello and welcome back to A Better World. This is your host, Mitchell J. Rabin, and I'm very glad you're joining us again today. Today we are going to be continuing our ongoing series about protecting the environment, about becoming more knowledgeable about the effects that human beings have been having on our environment, and different ways we can interact with our environment to help protect it from the ill acts of many of our brothers and sisters. To do this, to engage this conversation today, I have invited to join us on the air the director of a recently released film, A Fierce Green Fire. Mark Kitchell is the director. The Battle for a Living Planet. A Fierce Green Fire is a powerful film that just aired last week on PBS Sunday night, and it really rocked the nation because it tells a story of the history of the environmental movement, and it really opens up many of the subjects that need to be discussed about what we have done to our planet, what we have done to our national parks, where most of the dumping is occurring, which you could imagine is in ethnic neighborhoods, black neighborhoods, Latino neighborhoods across the country, and the damage this has done on so many levels. So, Walter,
the trees or something.
Hello?
Oh, hi, Mitchell.
Hi. Just stick with me for one moment, Mark, and I'll be right to you. We have with us an eager director, and for good reason. He's been at this project for years now. He has engaged some real leading figures in the film. He has narrators such as Robert Redford, Ashley Judd, Van Jones, Isabel Allende, and Meryl Streep, each of whom narrates a distinct segment of this film that is just riveting. It's beautiful. It really engages the audience, and it's a real honor and pleasure to have the director who has won many awards. This was shown at Sundance Festival and many others to really resounding merit and recognition. So, Mark, are you with us?
I am. Hi.
Hi there. Hi. Welcome to A Better World. Pleasure to have you on.
Thanks, Mitchell.
Mark, you endeavored on a big, big project here. It's certainly not possible to encompass the entirety of the history of the environmental movement in one film, although I remember seeing its first iteration perhaps a couple of years ago when you and I first met, and it was a good deal longer than it is now. What is it that inspired you to endeavor in such a big project as this?
Well, it was my wife Ruthie's idea, and she said, I know you ought to do the history of the environmental movement. And I'd done.
She just woke up one day and said, I have something good for you to do, Mark. You have nothing to do today.
Actually, it was riding up from L.A. to San Francisco on the freeway.
Yes, when there's a lot of time and it's very beautiful.
Right.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
And, I'd done Berkeley in the 60s, which was a sort of big picture history of the protest movements of that era. And, I think we were both intrigued by the idea that there ought to be a big picture history of the environmental movement, that 50 years after it had begun, it was sort of time to take on the broader and deeper meanings, to try and put together all those pieces of the biggest movement the world had ever seen, and yet one that's so sort of atomized and episodic that it didn't really know what it was about. So, we were looking for that next stage of what is this environmentalism all about?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because I think one of the effects of the film, and for those of you in the audience who have not seen it. And that's probably most of you so far, but I think that tide will change. It was aired on PBS last week. I saw it there. And do you have other showings that are upcoming on a national level, Mark?
Well, it's out on Netflix now, so anybody can stream it who has Netflix, and it's available on all your favorite platforms, so you can go to iTunes and Amazon, and you can download it or stream it. And it's still streaming from American Master's website for another 6 weeks or so into early June. And I think we.
So people can go to pbs.com and go to American Masters, and it could be seen in its abridged version there.
Yeah, there's two versions of the film. There's the TV version, which is 53 minutes, and there's the full-length film, which is 100 minutes, an hour 40. And on Netflix and on all your favorite platforms, you can get the full film, and on PBS American Masters, whatever that website is, you can see the 53-minute TV version probably through the first week in June.
Okay. Well, I really encourage our audience to tune into one of these platforms or venues to see either the full-length version or the abridged. Both are very good. Of course, the longer one is even more thorough in examining the history of the movement. One of the senses that I got, Mark, is that by watching the film, one can become more objective toward the entirety of the movement in this country, that because the subject itself is so sort of instinctive, it's so deep, it is us in so many ways, that one loses one's perspective on it. And to see it laid out the way you did, all the way back to really Teddy Roosevelt, the interesting Republican conservationist, all the way up, who began the U.S. Forest Service, the National Park Service, all the way through, really gives John Muir, the beginning of the Sierra Club, all the way through. We see the development of that, and we see the contrary. We see the development of the dam system on the Colorado River, for instance, and the way big business was seeking to usurp and exploit nature, which they just saw as a bevy of so-called free resources. So I really just want to commend you on that perspective that you bring to anybody sort of looking in who may not know anything formally about the movement. I mean, I've been in it forever, and yet I learned a tremendous amount just by kind of peeking in through the window that you provided us through this film. So just at the top,
I give your audience a quick sketch of the acts, the 5 acts, the 5 main stories?
Please do, yeah. Walk us through it,
great.
as well as, why don't you start, if you would, with the name of Fierce Green Fire, where that originates.
Well, Aldo Leopold was a young forest ranger about 100 years ago, and his job was to shoot wolves and predators so that there would be more deer. And so one day he shot a wolf, and he went down the draw to see, and he saw a fierce green fire in the dying wolf's eye. And that was his awakening. He began to understand that the wolf knew more about the order of things than he did. And if you go read Thinking Like a Mountain in Sand County Almanac by Aldo Leopold, that's the story, and there's more to it. It's a beautiful story of ecological awakening. And you've pretty well described the first act, which is around the conservation movement, principally of the 60s, and the main story is halting dams in the Grand Canyon, and the protagonist is David Brower and the Sierra Club. And there were a series of dams going back to Hetch Hetchy and Yosemite at the turn of the century, and then Dinosaur in the 50s, and they lost Glen Canyon, and then they decided to really make their stand in the Grand Canyon. And it was a pivotal event. It really was the end of the era of building big dams, and it was conservation's greatest victory, and it came right as conservation was flowering. And that happens just as Earth Day is coming along and reinventing it as the environmental movement with its focus on pollution. And that's the second act, is the 70s and pollution. And the main story there is Lois Gibbs and the Angry Housewives of Love Canal battling 20,000 tons of toxic waste that are buried in their neighborhood underneath the school where Lois's son was going to kindergarten. And that was a 2-year battle.
Lois Gibbs, who's the protagonist of that movement. Yeah.
Yes, indeed.
A Love Canal housewife in upstate New York.
Yes. And she's gone on and spent the last 35 years helping 10,000 other Loises take on all sorts of grassroots, not in my backyard struggles against toxics and pollutants and everything else. She's a great hero, one of the great unsung leaders of the movement. That act also has a section on environmental justice movements and how they began. And Dr. Bob Bullard is the one who guides us through that. It's a wonderful sequence. Everybody should see it, just to see environmental justice's origins. And the third act is about ecology movements and alternatives. And in the longer version, it has going back to the land and renewable energy and a lot of those. And that's narrated
by Van Jones.
Yes, it is. And but the main story there is Greenpeace in the early campaigns against whaling, Russian whaling, and the Canadians who would go out and club the baby harp seals to death for their white coats. And the protagonist in that act is Paul Watson, who was one of the founders of Greenpeace and then was forced out because he crossed their line about nonviolence by throwing a sealer's club in the water. And he went on to found Sea Shepherd, and that became his vehicle for taking on the pirate whalers. He cleared the North Atlantic of pirate whalers, and then went on and started scuttling and sinking the whaling nation's fleets. And he's just a great hero. And we just recently, Japan lost an International Court of Justice ruling and is being forced to stop whaling in the Antarctic, and he's been fighting that for 12 years. Anyway, I digress. In the fourth act,
that's a very important. That's a very important point. So this is interesting because there are two cases of an important departure from a state organization that you cite in the film. The first one is, I believe it was David Brower, correct?
Correct.
Who was forced out of the Sierra Club because he wanted to turn the entire planet into a national park, and they just wouldn't abide by that. I think that's just great.
Yeah, we love that
I was very young at the time, so I wasn't aware of those details. But and then the second one is Paul Watson leaving Greenpeace because his view was also, should we say, you could say more radical, but what we're really saying is actually more conservative. His view was to be more conserving of our habitat and our cetacean habitat, so to speak, and therefore he had to leave that context. And now he's scored this victory, you're saying, in Japan?
Yeah, against Japan. It was Australia who took Japan to court, but it was clearly as a result of Paul Watson and Sea Shepherd going out and challenging the Japanese scientific, in quotes, whaling for the last dozen years. And then in Act 4, we wanted to internationalize it and take it bigger because the movement keeps growing. Its issues get bigger and bigger. And so we took on in Act 4 sort of global resource issues and crises, and the one that we focus on is Chico Mendes and the rubber tappers in the Amazon saving the rainforest. And that's a great story.
The issue of deforestation, in other words.
Yeah. The ranchers coming in and the loggers coming in and cutting down the forest. And the rubber tappers were, they fought to set up reserves that would be rubber tapper reserves. And it was a great success. And then we broadened out to look at other international movements like Chipko in India, the tree huggers, and Wangari Maathai and the Greenbelt movement in Kenya. And then we bring it up to Act 5 and the mother of all environmental crises. You guessed it, climate change. And
yes,
we tell a 25-year story of struggle, and that sort of culminates with Copenhagen in 2009 and Paul Hawken doing his brilliant Blessed Unrest thesis that it's not a movement, it's humanity's immune response, and it's growing, and it brings together environmental and indigenous and social justice issues, and there are 2 million groups working on these issues worldwide, and then we end with a bang. We sort of throw the kitchen sink in and show 64 screens of people doing it everywhere all the time.
Yes. Sort of a la Blessed Unrest, the NGOs, the small organizations, even the social enterprise companies that are surrounded by eco-friendly, eco-sensitive, sustainable, and green values, priorities, and are living out of that and standing for it in the world. Yeah. It's a very moving film, Mark, and it really does. You do touch on a lot of material in it in a relatively short amount of time. We are speaking with the director of a just-released film, A Fierce Green Fire, The Battle for a Living Planet, Mark Kitchell. Mark has got an interesting background. He's a producer, writer, director, videographer, best known for his film back some time ago called Berkeley in the 60s, which won the Sundance Audience Award in 1990 and was nominated for an Academy Award as well as other top honors. He's gone on to now really unfold the history of the environmental movement in the United States, which this film does. It was just aired, as we were saying at the beginning of the show, on PBS just last Sunday, where you can still see it. Maybe it's on PBS.com or American Masters. If you Google that, you can see it there, the television version, or on Netflix and a few other places. So, Mark, I just really enjoyed the film. I feel like I've gotten a real crash course education about it. I'd like to kind of go back now that you've outlined the five acts that have been narrated sequentially by Robert Redford, Ashley Judd, Van Jones, Isabel Allende, and Meryl Streep. You just really lined up an all-star cast. Maybe I'll be in the next one. I don't know. If I'm really nice to you, maybe that'll happen. Why don't you tell us a little bit about, let's go back to the dams, because I think most of us don't really know much about the role of the dams, especially out by the Colorado River, and that the environmental movement, if you could have called it that at the time, really more the conservationist movement, struck a couple of real big victories way back that sort of set the pace for things in some very powerful ways. Could you go over who David Brower was and what happened back then, the story of the dams?
Sure. David Brower was the first hired paid Sierra Club staff. They hired him as executive director in 1953, and it was specifically to try and stop a dam and dinosaur national monument, which is sort of eastern Utah, where the Green and the Yampa rivers come together, I believe. There's a place called Echo Park, and they were going to, build one of a dozen dams that were part of the Colorado River Storage Project in that natural amphitheater. And the principle, as far as the Sierra Club was concerned, was, no dams in national parks. And they had lost that one in Hetch Hetchy with Yosemite National Park. But they were determined to go back and fight this time. And Brower led a 7-year struggle, and they used a lot of media, and Brower is sort of famous for
Let me just interject here. The Hetchy Dam was a lot of the work that John Muir was doing. Is that correct?
Yeah.
The founder of the Sierra Club.
He fought that. John Muir fought Hetch Hetchy for, I think, a dozen years, from about 1902 to 1914. And, San Francisco had to go and have an earthquake to force Congress to let it have this national park for a dam.
Yes.
A water supply, so that it wouldn't burn down anymore. But this was the 1950s, and they managed to stop the dam and dinosaur monument, but they made a deal that they would not oppose a dam further down the Colorado River at Glen Canyon. And the reason was Glen Canyon was not a national park. And Brower talks very movingly. This was it's the greatest mistake he ever made in his life. He was regretted it ever since. Glen Canyon was drowned. He tried to stop it, and couldn't stop it, and they drowned Glen Canyon. And now Lake Powell is 150 miles long, and it's fabulous scenery. And they went in there as the waters were rising and photographed it, and put out a book called The Place That No One Knew. And those photographs, they had a big effect on me as a kid, that book. It was an important, the kind of loss that, you're never going to let that happen again, kind of.
Yes.
And so when a couple of years later they proposed to build 2 dams and a tunnel to connect them that was basically going to empty the Grand Canyon of the river that carved it, they were just determined to stop it. And Congress had already passed the legislation and already authorized the dam, and Stuart Udall was Secretary of the Interior, and he was famous as a conservationist, but he's also from Arizona, and you can't fight dams when you're from Arizona. And so the odds were stacked against him, and as Jerry Mander says in the film, Brower was desperate, and he decided to try advertising, and he took out a full-page ad in the New York Times and a few other papers, and he talked about flooding the Grand Canyon for profit. And they got a huge response. They got about 10,000 pieces of mail to Stuart Udall. And they kept running ads.
Now, this is back in the 1960s, right? So this is way early, way before the ease of something like email or the Internet. So people would sit down and pen a letter or type a letter on a typewriter and sign it and lick the stamp and stick it on an envelope and mail it.
And then what happened was the IRS. They sicked the IRS on the Sierra Club.
So, but the point is that Udall had to back down.
Yeah, but not until, they tried to punish the Sierra Club by taking away their tax deductibility.
Right, their tax-exempt status. Yeah.
And
so they sicked the IRS on the Sierra Club, right?
Yeah, they took away their status, their tax deductibility, and that was like a jiu-jitsu move. People were so outraged at that they joined the Sierra Club in droves, and it really swung the support to the Sierra Club for halting the dams in the Grand Canyon. And so it's a great case of the opponents doing your work
David
for
and Goliath.
you, right?
Yeah,
right.
David and Goliath. Yeah. Isn't that interesting? Right. So, in other words, when the administration politicized the IRS and tried to take away the tax-exempt status, it worked. It just bit them in the butt. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's an amazing story. So the Sierra Club was truly one of the probably the first environmental association, tax-exempt association in the United States. And it has gone on to this day. I mean, it's, of course, gone through any number of different perturbations of being more conservative and more progressive. It got bandied about. It's not one clean, linear thing at all. It's really
the great democracy
wavers.
of the environmental movement, and it's got chapters, and they all vote, and it's an amazing organization. And often it has been too conservative or not ready to be as out front as it should be. And
yes,
but it was the conservation organization that survived Earth Day and the rise of a new environmental movement the best. And
yes, I see.
And it's still to this day. To this day, they still don't allow their people to get arrested. They lifted it one time for the Keystone Pipeline protest outside the White House, but they still haven't, lifted entirely their ban on getting arrested. So, they're that kind of organization. They're mainstream. And but still, they're a fabulous organization, and they reinvented themselves so well by bringing in Michael Brune from Rainforest Action Network and so on. And I just, over the last couple of years of distributing the film, I've been really impressed with the Sierra Club and all their chapters all over the country. It's an extraordinary group of people.
Do you know, Mark, how many members they have?
I think they're up to 1.5 or 2 million. It's certainly over a million.
That might stand as the very largest, and quantitatively the largest in the country.
Yeah. And Mitchell, when I was doing research and reading the Whole Earth catalog, they had a page on environmental groups, and there were 6 of them listed. Can you believe that? 1968 or whenever that was, there were only 6 environmental groups.
Amazing. That's amazing. And the Whole Earth Catalog was its own environmental organization, I like the way you had Stuart Brand, the founder of the Whole Earth Catalog, which I adored back then. It was bigger than I was, but I loved that catalog. Everybody did, and it really was a Bible. I love that you got him in there. So there's some nostalgia in it all for, I think, those of us of our general generation, which is fabulous. So
let's talk a little bit about environmental justice, and I don't know. If
I would like to move
sequentially.
Let's move sequentially through the acts here, so people can kind of follow and then listen back to this interview perhaps and say, yes, they talked about this, they talked about that. Well, yeah, indeed. Another very important piece was the merging of it's not exactly altogether a merging, but when the black movement, the civil rights movement, opened up to recognizing the importance of the environmental movement, that they were really singing the same song in so many ways. That was why don't you talk about that?
Well, Bob Bullard would say the civil rights movement didn't get it, and the environmental movement didn't get it, and it took 2 years for those two movements to come together. And
what years were those?
I would say that they were, let's see, Warren County happens in 83, and I think it would probably be the 80s.
Yes.
That it was happening in the mid-80s. I think by 87, there was a robust environmental justice movement. And in 91 or 92, there was a People of Color Environmental Summit in Washington, which was its real sort of announcement that it had arrived. Bob Bullard's original book is called Dumping in Dixie, and his wife is he's a sociologist. His wife was a lawyer who was doing the first civil rights case of suing the city of Houston for putting all their dumps and incinerators in the black neighborhoods. And he did a study, and he found that 100% of the dumps and 4 out of the 5 incinerators were all in black neighborhoods. And then he started looking around the country, and he found it was true in Dallas, and it was true all through the southern toxic waste belt, which stretches from the old mines of West Virginia down to Emil, Alabama, which is the biggest toxic waste dump in the country. And he tells a very funny story about West Virginia, how Union Carbide, he says, most people don't even know they're blacks in West Virginia, and this company, Union Carbide, found them. The only factory that manufactures methyl isocyanate, MIC, the same chemical that killed all those people in Bhopal, India, was in Institute, West Virginia, and Institute, West Virginia, has always been 95% black. It's just it's a wonderful laugh.
So in a sense, we almost had our own Bhopal right here in West Virginia.
Yes, there's been a couple of spills from that Union Carbide plant. Indeed.
Yes.
Excuse me.
Sure.
So,
it's interesting. I work in some measure with a really interesting emergence from this movement. Jerome Ringo, who testifies now in front of Congress and has been for many years, who started the Apollo Project out on the West Coast. He's good friends with Van Jones and many others, and we work together on a couple of environmental initiatives on a global level. And I was thinking about him as I was watching Bob Bullard, who I think must have been one of his heroes, because you had a gentleman from Louisiana who was an activist who was protesting the petrochemical pollution there. And that's where Jerome is actually from, and he was in the petrochemical industry until he had his own awakening, if you will, and changed sides, and has been a major voice for both black Americans and the environmental justice movement altogether. So that really kind of hit home with me. This whole idea of apartheid, you mentioned, American style, Bob Bullard brought up. Very interesting that it would show up
but
here.
But then he goes
right?
on, and at the end he talks about how they decided that it's race and class.
Yes.
And that if white people are getting dumped on, or brown people, it's solidarity. And that's really where they've been at since then. And
sure, that's where Martin Luther King. That's where Martin Luther King ultimately got to as well, shortly before they assassinated him, where it wasn't a question of color any longer. It was a question of class, and it was a question of money. And when they realized that he caught on to that one, that was really going a little too far. Yeah. Let me just let everybody know we are speaking with Mark Kitchell, who is the director of a film that just was released, A Fierce Green Fire, The Battle for a Living Planet. You're listening to Mitchell J. Rabin on A Better World. We're on here every Wednesday night at 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Visit us at our website at www.abetterworld.tv. And if you don't yet get the newsletter, please do sign up there. It's free. It's out once a week, and it lets you know who we have on as our guests, when we have guests, that is, which is usually, on both the radio show and the weekly TV show here in New York City. In fact, Mark, you'll be interested to know that this week on the A Better World TV, I had, first Dr. John Lilly, famous psychoanalyst and inventor, founder of the Cetacean Nation, which actually became recognized at the United Nations, where the dolphins and whales were recognized as a nation, acknowledged as a nation. That was the work of John Lilly, and with the help of Michael Bailey, who was a key figure in the Greenpeace movement and played a very active, and I should say activist role, putting his life on the line like so many Greenpeace members and activists have. And so I had that on
really been
Monday night,
the heart
and you
soul
tonight.
Of this movie.
Excuse me? I'm sorry?
That's the heart and soul of this movie, is we decided that we were going to come at it from movement and activism. And, the usual environmental film is something that's built around an issue, and it reveals the problem and the crisis, and then it ends with a cry for help, for people to do something.
And a call to action.
Yeah, and we thought that no matter how good it is, often comes across as an eco-bummer. And we thought it would be much more engaging and impassioned and better for the audience if we came at it from the point of view of activism. And you get to see people taking up these issues and fighting with everything they've got against enormous odds and succeeding in the end. And because it is 4 stories of success against enormous odds, and then the 5th one, climate change, is still in suspense. And so we found that to be a much more engaging.
You could say that again.
It talk about it? Why don't we talk about? I just don't want to miss out on talking about climate change.
No. We'll get back to it. But you know what? Let's circle back, because not that we have to be so sequential, but I really would like to talk for a moment about. But you really do outline victories, and I think that's a real strong part of the film. And one of them is Lois Gibbs at Love Canal holding some EPA representatives hostage, and that ended up forcing the hand of the White House, President Jimmy Carter, actually coming to Love Canal. Maybe you can tell us that story. That's such a heroic story with such a victory on behalf of the people.
Well, it's the classic not in my backyard story. It's the classic sort of grassroots. It represents a moment at which not only did the toxic start bubbling up, but it's also where the focus of the movement started to shift from upper and middle class to lower and working class, where it became more about folding birds and fishes dying, and it, I think in important ways, became a more humanist movement that had a broader appeal in society. But they moved into this neighborhood and discovered they were on top of 20,000 tons of toxic waste, and and Lois at first with shaking knees went around the neighborhood trying to get a petition signed to close the school, and the school administrator said, if I listen to one irate hysterical housewife, I have to close the whole school.
Right.
And so, as she went around, she discovered that everybody else in the neighborhood was suffering, and their basements were leaking, and they had cancer and birth defects, and double rows of teeth and 2 ears, and and an important weapon in what they did was that they did their own health study. And that health study they then took to the state, and they threw it on the floor and said it's useless housewife data. And so they then had to do their own study, and they found the exact same results. That 56% of the children in Love Canal were born with birth defects. But then they attributed it to a random clustering of genetically defective people. Can you believe that?
Can you believe that? I mean,
it's so self-serving because
they could even say that with a straight face. It's unbelievable that they think that people would believe that nonsense. It's
well,
so
if they admitted
insulting.
that, there were 40 other sites in New York alone that they had to clean up, and so
yes.
So Lois led a 2-year battle. The residents battled hard. They forced the state to bring in the federal government. The federal government did a study of chromosome damage and found that there was a lot of it, and that was the straw that broke the camel's back. And the EPA recommended relocation, and the White House vetoed it. And that's the point at which they took a couple of EPA officials hostage. And they gave
basically the housewives, let's make the point. The housewives at Love Canal took the male representatives of the EPA hostage, locked them in the house. Yeah.
They did.
I hope they didn't have much food in the refrigerator.
Oh, it was fine, in fact. But they agreed to let him go, but only after their congressman had met with President Carter, and they had put Carter on notice that in 2 days' time, if they did not have an order to evacuate Love Canal, that they were going to make what happened today look like a Sesame Street picnic. I love that line. And
truly,
and it worked.
Truly.
Yes. And this media countdown began, 12 hours, 8 hours, so on. And so Lois calls up the White House, and they agreed. They agreed to relocate everybody.
She had let the hostages go by then. Is that correct?
Yes, she did.
How long were they in captivity?
Probably about 7 or 8 hours.
Oh, I see. Okay. So it wasn't an overnight
like
thing.
the Iran, and it was the same time that the Iran hostage crisis was going on.
Yes, exactly. Isn't that an interesting parallel?
Yeah.
Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you for walking us through that. It ended up that Jimmy Carter himself, President Carter, went to the Love Canal to stand there, right there with Lois Gibbs.
And he said there must never be another Love Canal in our country. And guess how many they found? 50,000. 50,000.
Of toxic dumping sites in people's backyards?
Yeah. Yep, all over the country. And it was just a shocking, horrid, toxic legacy that corporations of every sort had been committing unregulated for, most of the 20th century. And, there it was revealed. And it took that. Love Canal was not the first nor the worst. It was, the difference was Lois Gibbs and the people of Love Canal really fought to expose what was going on, and they really made it into. And of course, Carter comes to Love Canal just a week before Reagan defeats him for president in 1980. Mm-hmm. And they tried to roll back all this stuff. They particularly tried to roll back Superfund, which was passed by a lame duck Congress. And it's been a long, hard battle, but they made a great deal of good and cleaned up a lot of places. And Lois, at first, her task was, the way she saw it, was to plug up all the toilets. And they were really working on the end of the pipe, and they managed to stop all new toxic waste dumps in this country since then.
That is extraordinary.
And then they turned around and started working on the front of the pipe, and things like the McToxics campaign forced McDonald's to give up their polystyrene containers, and they worked with DuPont to clean up their manufacturing processes. And it was amazing how much could be cleaned up if you just sort of put your mind to it.
Yeah, exactly.
So,
No, that's a very good point, and it's also interesting because she is an unsung hero. You do not see her in the papers. You do not see her at the conferences. I mean, as far as I know. And yet she's working just, it sounds, tirelessly behind the scenes, making this incredible progress in very real and measurable ways of protecting our rivers and streams and communities from toxic dumping and chemicalization like that.
She's taking on fracking now, and
I was just going to say that's one overt omission in the film that, you know, I know there's only so much you can handle, but fracking is very much the issue of our day, and a very important one at that. So
she's come up with Freddy the Frackosaurus, this inflatable dinosaur that they're going to take around to demonstrations, and, you know.
Oh, that is very funny. Let's fast forward now to, let's just look for a moment at the new Alchemy Institute and John Todd, and looking at some solutions that have been surfacing. Could you talk a little bit about that? And then Paul Hawken.
Okay, well, parallel to this environmental movement around pollution, there was a whole wave of people who were sort of alternative ecology movements, and they were really looking to develop alternatives for housing, for agriculture, for energy, for pretty much the way we make and do everything. And they, you know, and one of the greatest of them was the new Alchemy Institute, where John and Nancy Todd and a bunch of other people were really trying to do a lot of things. They're most famous for what they call a living machine, which was a big greenhouse with big tanks of fluid, which they used for three things: to clean their sewage, and to grow food, and to heat and cool the ark they're building.
Yes.
And it's a great intuitive structure and just gorgeous and beautiful, and I wish there were more of them around.
Yes.
There were other people building geodesic domes, and, you know, organic agriculture was starting at this time. And the 70s I remember best for the alternative energy. You know, in California, wind turbines started to go up, and there was sort of a wind rush. And they were experimenting with photovoltaics and solar thermal projects in the desert. And there was even a place down in the Imperial Valley where they were taking cow shit and turning it into power. And it was...
Yeah, I remember in 1976, Mark, I was at a theater festival in Baltimore, and part of it, there was a school bus that ran on chicken dung. I never heard of anything such like. I mean, I was all of like 22 years old. That is just amazing. You know?
And then along came Amory Levins,
Go ahead.
and we did not know. Amory Levins taught us all so much about energy. You know, until that time we didn't have a proper appreciation of how important energy was, and he came up with his end-use, least-cost analysis, which was really about finding the cheapest way to satisfy our needs. And it was an analysis that really kind of transformed. And he's most famous for pointing to conservation and efficiency as the first great leaps in energy towards renewable energy. And he came up with the soft path as opposed to the hard path of coal, oil, and
describe
nuclear.
What that means.
Well, the soft path was based on, it was basically conservation and efficiency gains that were going to lead to renewables and a world that could be powered entirely by renewables, and we could phase out nuclear and coal and oil. But the first gigantic step, which we still haven't really fulfilled or exhausted, was all the efficiency and conservation gains. And, you know, we're still finding that what he called negawatts, and the cheapest megawatts are the ones that you can save from ever having to use or produce. Yeah. And he's brilliant. He's also been at it for 35 years, kind of like Lois. And
that's right.
He's come up with brilliant things like the hypercar, and he's somebody else. We didn't get to do him justice in this film, so I'm thinking about a new film that'll be more about things like that.
Yeah, I know.
But that's
moment. Thank you about that. Talk a moment in our closing about Chico Mendes, and then of course you've got a relative to climate change. You've got to talk about 350.org and Bill McKibben for a moment, please.
Is this the closing? Do I have 3 minutes? What do I got?
Yes, you do. Yes, you do.
Okay.
You've got 5.
Well, by the 80s, there were global resource crises emerging all over the world, and the forests were maybe the most explicit, but it was happening with soil, with water, with the oceans, with wildlife and biodiversity. The sixth great extinction was beginning. There were all these global-scale resource issues, and that became, by the late 80s, I think, the terms of the battle. And, that was about the point at which James Hansen did his famous testimony before Congress, in which he said the greenhouse effect is real and it's changing our climate now, and we got to do something about it. I believe that was in '88. And curious footnote, when he gave that testimony, we were at 350 parts per million on carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And that has subsequently been determined to be the safe limit and the name of a powerful movement to fight climate change. And so it's been since 1988, it's been 25, 26 years that we've been fighting this. And for most of the 90s, there wasn't much of a movement against it. It was mostly scientists and the IPCC and people writing books, McKibben and Elizabeth Colbert and people like that. There was a precursor in ozone depletion. And when it became clear in the 80s that there was a hole over the Antarctic, an ozone hole, the world really came together, led by the U.S., and really did something about it, the Montreal Protocol. And people thought, well, we'll just do that. We'll run that scenario again, and we'll just deal with it, except that it strikes at the very heart of our Western industrial civilization, and there's nothing you can do short of getting rid of coal and oil to stop putting CO2 in the atmosphere. And it's been the mother of all battles, and yet I would say it's not the main thing. I wanted to do an Act 6, which is it's not just climate change, and I wanted to talk about the sustainable revolution that I believe is bigger than the Industrial Revolution. It's going to take about as long, and really it's about civilizational transformation. It's about changing the way we make and do everything. And a lot of it has to do with how we think of ourselves and the stuff that you do so well, Mitchell. And, it's got to be a thoroughgoing transformation of our civilization if we're going to survive and, come into sustainable balance with nature. And
yes, indeed.
So that's sort of where we got to. And
that's a very important point.
On.
Exactly. I think Act 6 really needs to be written and filmed, Mark. I really do. I got to tell you, I spend probably most of my time looking at the psychological component and the perception belief system component in everything that's going on, including watching your film. If you think about the antagonist, for instance, to David Brower in government, who his name is escaping me this very moment, the head of the Forest Service, Gifford Pinchot, who was acting as an antagonist back then, and then fast forward and you find the same kind of thing then with Udall. And what you see is that there are people that come into this world believing that the earth is just there, sort of like a be kind of licked and, pardon my French, sucked by anyone who has the wherewithal to do so, whoever can kind of get to there first. And then there are others who see it as a land, a planet of bounty and abundance to be shared in by all in some kind of, equality doesn't exist. It never has existed. It probably never will exist. But in some kind of reasonable, humane way that all can share, and that it needs to be taken care of, that it needs to be preserved and conserved and respected as a sacred space.
Well, probably
and
the
what is it that forms the
film.
mindset? But what is the mindset that forms the former, and what is the mindset that forms the latter type of psychology? Excuse me, what was that?
Probably the basic lesson of the film is that we need bottom-up protest forcing the top-down politics, and that the movement will never get anywhere until people are active and out in the streets and working on these issues and really fighting for it, because we found, especially with climate change, over and over and over again, that without bottom-up pressure, nothing changes. So that's the thing that it really needs.
It's a good point. At the end of the day, I understand that, external shock is one of the most potent forces we have in the world. I really do. But because of what my background is, I tend to want to deconstruct the mindset that created the problem in the first place and deal with it really on, you could say, that micro level, the psychological level, which then spills out to the sociological level, and examine how values get formed and priorities formed in the first place, what part of the brain is getting activated, and what parts of the brain remain dormant.
Well, that's the basic lesson of ecology, is that it's all connected. So while you're doing that, we want everybody out in the streets, too.
That's right. Listen, Mark Kitchell, I want to just thank you for being on today and for your good work as a filmmaker and director.
You're welcome.
It's really, truly a pleasure. Absolutely. What is your website for folks?
It's afierscreenfire.com, www.afierscreen.afierscreenfire.com. And everything's on there, including my phone number. And that will lead you probably to all the other websites, too. And
yes, indeed. Well, listen,
all right.
Appreciate it. Keep up the good work.
Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely.
Thanks, Mitchell.
Talk soon.
All right.
Sure. Bye-bye now.
Bye-bye.
Wow, that was truly a splendid film that, he used the phrase eco-bummer, a lot of reviewing of ecological damage is a bummer, no question about it. This film really does pack a punch because it's one victory after another, and it's very, very uplifting to look at our history of the environmental movement from that point of view. We're altogether too familiar with the, you could almost say, daily losses, the daily crushes we experience these days as a result of the power, let's say, of ALEC and of the Koch brothers and of their control of our Congress. I mean, it's insane. And while things haven't changed all that much, it has become more amplified, in some ways more severe, but also more polarized in that more people are recognizing the very vital importance of our relationship to our weather, to our climate, and who we are relative to that pollution, and that man really does have a role. Yes, there are cycles. Of course there are. We rely on cycles. There are ice ages. We know there are solar storms. There are asteroids, folks. I know. And there is what we've been given to take care of, what we are here to steward, which is our beautiful planet and her nature Gaia as a living being from which we all come and which we are obliged for all reasons to nurture. And that's so much of the kind of attitude that we here at A Better World are seeking to cultivate in ourselves personally and in our audiences, because it's this attitude of reverence, of respect, not to say without iconoclasm, don't get me wrong, and irreverence. That is an important place for that too. But at base, we are these biological/spiritual beings trying to have a human experience. And it ain't going all that well, if you ask me. It's very, very jagged. And that's why I ultimately come back to the individual, come back to the system in which we are all raised and reared, and the family unit where we learn our fundamental sense of value and proportion and priorities and education in our earliest years, going back in utero, folks. Yes, yes. Because we know that one person makes a huge difference. And people, by and large, tend to be followers, not leaders. And sometimes the best follower has leadership skills by knowing how to follow. By the way, I know that may sound paradoxical, because it is. But we make leaders as well. And in Mark Kitchell's film, A Fierce Green Fire, he shows some leadership in the personages of Lois Gibbs, who around the Love Canal, which we've spoken about several times this evening. Teddy Roosevelt, who Republican, out there as a conservationist, looking to protect nature from really corporate exploitation. Back then, at the turn of the 19th into the 20th century, we have these characters. Then what we didn't mention today is when the book The Silent Spring by Rachel Carson emerged and the effect that had on our consciousness as a collective. It's so interesting. And we go from Carter, who put solar panels on the roof of the White House, to Reagan, who summarily removed them and says, and this quote is in the film, sure, there are a lot of environmentalists out there, and I don't think they're going to be satisfied until the White House becomes a bird's nest. That kind of ha-ha, backslapping attitude, which is just the epitome of ignorance that the American people in their John Wayne-style mindset just adore. And yeah, it's funny. I laugh too, but I'm also crying at the stupidity that it represents and reflects in our so uneducated, and I don't mean just intellectually, I mean emotionally uneducated populace. It's just, unfortunately, altogether too true. Not to say in the midst of it all, there aren't brilliant people, emotionally intelligent people. There are many, many, I would even say most people have a level of brilliance, genius in many cases, the rank and file so-called average person. But, we've got to make this more widespread. We've got to let go of holding on to ideas of concepts. Well, you can say, you're holding on to a concept that CO2 is affecting our climate. Well, any scientist is going to tell you that if there's an excess of any element, any chemical, you're going to be in trouble. And CO2 is a natural part of the system. There's no problem with CO2 in itself. My God, CO2 is the tree's oxygen. So, no, that's not the problem. Don't misunderstand, please. but the excess which comes about as a result of our habits and our addiction to power and money and not being able to get out of a cycle of oil and methane release and heavy-duty meat eating and agribusiness and food pollution. And when you look at the entire picture, the entire planetary picture, and what we have done in a space that could have been made so beautiful if we were to harmonize with nature. The whole domain of biomimicry, for instance, speaks to that. The work of Horst Rechelbacher in a book that I interviewed him about, and Horst Rechelbacher, who was really a dear friend, not a close friend, but certainly a friend over the course of years. I met him in the early 90s, just this past February, and I experienced it as a tremendous loss. Horst, for those of you who may not know by name, was the founder of Aveda and did so much to help to enrich the indigenous people of the Amazon, especially by purchasing their plants for the Aveda essences and oils. He did so much to help so many, and he got rather wealthy from his good work at Aveda and then selling the company on from there. But his dedication to humanity was magnificent. I truly loved him and had the great honor and pleasure and privilege of getting to know him fairly well over the years. This kind of heroism does show up, and God bless that it does. If you go, by the way, to my website, abetterworld.tv, and put his name in, you can dig up that interview with him, although I did a TV interview with him back in the mid-90s originally. So we as a people need to just wake up. God knows we need to change our ways, our habits, our thinking, our belief systems, and from there, let's just say we're just responsible for pollution. Our personal pollution, thank you very much, as well as systemic pollution based on the way our corporations operate and are allowed to spew out chemicals into our precious waters. In closing, I want to let you all know that I will be starting yet another radio show back at Progressive Radio Network on May 12th, folks. Why does that date sound familiar? Yes, it's my birthday. Indeed, I will be back on the airwaves of Progressive Radio Network on May 12th, 9 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, with a show called The Progressive Film Hour with Mitchell Rabin. The Progressive Film Hour with me. So please come and join us over there at Progressive Radio Network. You will most likely be able to hear it from abetterworld.tv, and you will be able to call in to listen, just like you can do here at 602-753-1860, 602-753-1860. It's all on the website. Yeah. But we're going to be focusing on that show on progressive films, environmental films, political social justice, environmental justice, and we're opening up with Water Wars. So that will be May 12th, Monday, May 12th. And I'm encouraging people to watch the films ahead of time. I will have them listed both at abetterworld.tv and on prn.fm, Gary Null's wonderful progressive station. I was on it near the beginning for about 6.5 years, up to around a year and a half ago with A Better World, and took a little bit of a break, but I'm back now as of May 12th. So thank you so much for joining us this evening. I hope you enjoyed that as I did, listening to Mark Kitchell tell these stories about his film. He had just excellent people on, narrated by none other than Robert Redford, Ashley Judd, Van Jones, Isabel Allende, I believe the cousin of the former president of Chile, and Meryl Streep. So many people are into the environmental movement, as well they should, as well we all should, and need to stand up in our own unique respective ways to make a difference, because our world, my friends, is getting gobbled up. And if you go to our website, you'll see a 93-second animation of the story of climate change. It's very cute, and you'll see it there in the carousel on the very front of it, so enjoy it. Thanks again. Remember that we operate by some fees and donations. If you have it in your heart and your pocketbook to make any kind of donation, either a one-time or monthly, we so appreciate it here at A Better World, so we can continue to do our work that is just unstoppable. So on that note, thanks again, and yes, we'll be speaking with Ralph Nader soon about having him on as a guest too to talk about his book as well. Again, Mitchell J. Rabin for A Better World, website abetterworld.tv. Join us, become part of the family, the community, get on the newsletter, and I'll see you all next